So I'm going to go ahead and get started. It looks like all of our presenters are here too. So it turns out we're actually the first of these online track sessions to actually happen. Nobody else has gone before us, so we're a bit of a guinea pig for how this is working. So thank you everybody for showing up and actually making this start off smoothly so far. I'd like to welcome you to our virtual track session titled Innovations in Teaching Environmental and Resource Economics. My name is Carson Reeling from Purdue University, and I'm the organizer of this session and also the incoming chair of the Land, Water, and Environmental Economics section. Again, I'll start by saying thank you to our presenters for maintaining their flexibility during this process, and also to the TLC section for jointly sponsoring this session. Before I start with the presentations, I have a few instructions I want to pass along. This is a lightning session. That means we'll have 8 presenters, each of whom will have a total of 9 minutes to present. The plan is to have a 7-minute presentation or thereabouts with 2 minutes for questions. During this time of questions, please only ask brief clarifying questions. There will be plenty of time for more substantive questions at the end of the session. I'll keep time and will update presenters on their remaining time via their private chat windows, so please keep an eye on that. If you are not presenting, please mute your microphones. To do this, if you're not familiar with Zoom, just go ahead and move your mouse to the bottom of the screen and click the button that looks like a microphone. Got an arrow, a line through it. That means you're muted. You may keep your camera on if you'd like, although doing so may affect the quality of the session on your end if there are bandwidth constraints. To turn off your video, go ahead and just click the button at the bottom of the screen that looks somewhat like a camera. Now, as a heads up, AAEA is going to be recording this session. It should be posted to the AAEA online learning and teaching resources website at some point after the session concludes. And finally, note for the presenters, you'll have the opportunity to submit any papers associated with these presentations to a special theme of Applied Economics Teaching Resources, AAEA's relatively new online journal. Please, if you're a presenter, stay until the end of the track session for a brief discussion with Jason Bergtold, the editor of this journal, about procedures for doing this. So again, thanks again for coming. Really appreciate everybody's flexibility and willingness to participate in what is sort of a weird online virtual format for this. We're going to start with Jeff England at the University of Arizona. To all presenters, you can share your slides by clicking the share screen button at the bottom of the screen and then choosing the window that contains your slides. So Jeffrey, go ahead and get started whenever you're ready.
Thanks. Actually, I'm at Arizona State University.
Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry.
It's you know, a minor thing, but
yeah,
worthwhile. Let's see here. Can you see my slides?
Not yet.
All right. Can you see me now?
See you. Hold on. Let's see.
No, not yet.
I'm sharing like crazy. I'm way oversharing. Oh, I know what I'm doing wrong.
Okay.
Now you got it?
Yes, there it goes. We see your background, I should say, your desktop.
You see any slides?
No. You might have to choose the screen that has your... There we go.
Now.
My students, it says.
Okay. Yeah, there you go. All right, let me go back one. Okay, so here we are, distance teaching of environmental resource economics. I want to talk a little bit about some experiences that I had porting an online class from Arizona State University to a refugee camp in Uganda. So first off, this is my classroom. I'm staying in Tempe, and these are the students that I'm teaching. So I want you to get a sense of the physical space and the students that I'm working with. So This is part of ASU's Education for Humanity program. There are about 65 million people who reside in refugee camps worldwide. There's a whole bunch of reasons why people end up in refugee camps. Everything from famine to you're in a city that's getting bombed. If you're in Syria and they start bombing your town, it doesn't matter if you're a doctor or a ditch digger. You're running for your life and you end up in a camp. And virtually everybody in this situation loses any certifications or vocational proof that they once had. You just become an anonymous person. And they may be there for decades. And there's not really a good way out. And part of what ASU's Education for Humanity is about is providing a verifiable education credential. And this was part of a beginning attempt to work at a certificate that Arizona State University would issue. And it would be through the Morrison School of Agribusiness. And the NGO which is pioneering this is Wendell International. So the three of us worked together to create a class and see if it would work. So this was the pilot. So my task was to rebuild my ASU online agribusiness microeconomics class for deployment and teaching in the Nakivale refugee settlement in Uganda. So because this class potentially could lead to ASU awarded certificates, I needed to keep the quality the same. We needed to learn some techniques, and we needed to gauge the potential for extending these methods to other classes. So there was a methodological component to it as well as a technical component to it. One of the reasons that this was possible and what made it exciting to do online was ASU's engineering school has come up with what they call a solar spell, which is basically a little tiny solar powered mini computer where we can load online classes. So once the class was built, it was loaded up into Solar Spell. When you saw the photo of my students, those are actually students working on a solar spell. Everything that we did proceeded entirely from open source material. We worked with a major publisher who handles my class here at ASU, and they just weren't comfortable with having all their proprietary stuff, their PowerPoints, their study guides, out in the wild in a developing country in a refugee camp. So I did all of my work based on the OpenStax microeconomics, which was fantastic. Okay, I did not have to compromise on anything because I used OpenStax. That was wonderful. So one of the challenges is, of course, this has got to be asynchronous. I can't actually be online with the students. They've got one hotspot in the camp. The students did have, a lot of students had cell phones, which had some coverage, but basically they had to come in to the schoolroom, which you saw, and do the class there. We did everything with Riot and then asynchronous, that's it. But I mimicked my AGB 250 class virtually identically. I had identical learning outcomes. I used identical approaches. We had 30 learners. I thought it was kind of interesting that a quarter of them were actually Ugandan nationals who came into the camp to take the class. And the only thing we required was a basic proficiency in English. Now, as I indicated before, there's wild differences with these students. These were all really good students, but some of them had graduate school training, but they had never taken agribusiness microeconomics. I had 14 units, the elements of the class where we had class videos, we had readings, which was the text, PowerPoint slides. I did polls where you answered questions and the whole class would answer the poll. We had reflection boards where they would write for me, 1 or 2 sentences about why they answered each poll question the way they did. And then I would interact asynchronously with them on the reflection boards. We had quizzes, we had interactives amongst the students, and then one nice aspect to the class was our library science people got involved, and they put together a series of contemporary readings that we hoped would be relevant for these students. We had 87% completion. I can tell you that the average grade was an A. These are extremely motivated students. It was a source of some concern going into it, like how is this going to go? And I can tell you flat out that the average undergraduate at Arizona State University is not nearly as motivated as people who want to get out of refugee camps. That's just like, they're here to learn, they're here to get credit, they're here to get out.
It is public time.
Okay. So we had I got a couple of students. We interviewed them all. I didn't, but someone did over there. And I thought it was kind of interesting. There's 2 students that talked about the class. We had student, Kosigi was never in an online class before in her life, had never seen it. She liked it a lot. Mugabe, it was interesting. This was actually the big highlight of the class for everybody, which was market structure, because they all have, many of them have gardens, and they market their produce in town. And when they learned about monopolistic competition, they all got organized and started to sell different looking bundles of vegetables. They realized they had all been selling exactly the same bundle and competing with each other. So it was, they really kind of brought it to the forefront and brought it to bear. So it was a very rewarding class to do, and it was quite successful. And I look forward to doing things in the future. Thank you.
That's really neat. So thank you, Jeffrey, for sharing that. Does anybody have, we got about a minute for brief questions, and then again at the end of this, we'll open it up for more substantive questions. Feel free to unmute your mic and ask away. Okay, hearing none, we'll just wait until the end, again, for those substantive questions. The next person to present, hold on, let me pull that up on the presentation list, will be Misty Sharp from University of Florida. Thanks again, Jeffrey.
So everyone can see my presentation and me?
Yes.
Ah, good news, good news. All right, well, great. Well, I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about what I did to make learning about climate change fun and interactive. So as you guys probably know, teaching environmental courses, it's sometimes hard to teach about climate change. There's a couple reasons for that. Some of it is climate denial or cognitive dissonance. Some of it is the challenge of local versus global, which you wouldn't think would be a problem at Florida where I teach, but it is. Heavy content, it's so depressing to sometimes talk about. And of course, there's often in popular media a little bit of a disconnect between science and policy. And so then that makes students actually really kind of confused about climate change. But at the end of the day, adaptation and mitigation of climate change is really just the provision of a public good or avoidance of a public bad. And so I was thinking, why not just use a public good game to teach them about climate change negotiations and climate change policy? So as you guys all know, as economists, a public good game is really just highlighting the conflict between individual incentives and social incentives to provide a good that's both non-excludable and non-rival, and hence subject to free riding. The way these games are played is that individuals are endowed with some sort of a private good, and then they can contribute that to a collective good. Of course, this is nice because it allows us to talk about Pareto optimality and free riding. Usually it's better to act selfishly than it is to contribute to the public good. Behavioral economics, how your behavior is impacted by what other people are doing. Political economy, how policymakers are subject to domestic constituents as well as their allies internationally and how that impacts their behavior in international negotiations. And then, of course, institutional economics, right? Rules matter, and our provision of a private good or a public good can be achieved if we have the right rules in place. So what I do is I play 6 different games with my students, and I've done this over the course of many semesters. I don't know how many times I've taught this class by now, but a lot. And so I've played this with them a lot. It's always really a lot of fun. The first game is just a basic public good game. So I give them all, I endow them with bonus points. I don't know about you guys, but my students see regular points as if I have time. Bonus points, oh my gosh, this is life-changing. I will do everything for these bonus points. So I endow them with bonus points, and then I allow them to contribute some of these bonus points that I've gifted them magically from thin air to the provision of a public good. And the public good, you can parameterize this however you want to, depending on your class size. My class is typically 80 to 100 people, so a conversion rate of 40 makes sense. So that relates to if everyone contributed 1 to the collective good, it would be 2 bonus points that are accrued to the entire class. So then the total bonus points are their endowment, minus their contribution to the public good, plus the provided public good. Then in the next game, I put a little twist on it. I have a future generations public good game. So they contribute again to the public good, but the public good doesn't accrue to them. It accrues to my future teachings of the course. And then see how that changes their behavior. My third game is a threshold public good game. Instead of working towards public good with a direct conversion, I require them to meet a threshold of contributions in order to have a provided public good in the amount of just 2 solid bonus points that everyone gets. Then I twist again and make a threshold public bad game. So now what they're trying to do is they're trying to meet that threshold to avoid negative bonus points. And I'm very strict on this. I tell them, if you contribute all 3 of your endowment to the provision of the public good and it doesn't get met, that threshold doesn't get met, I will take away points from your score. So this becomes quite contentious, and they start getting angry with me, which is fun too. Anyways, and then I play this again in unequal endowments. So I give them different amounts of endowment. So maybe for game 5, it's a threshold public good game, just like game 3, but maybe they only have 1 that they could contribute to the public good. Another person has 2, another person has 3, another person has 4, and then they get the opposite endowment for the last game. So there's unequal ability to contribute to the public good in those last 2 games, which of course simulates the inequity in dealing with climate change. So then the results of the game are usually pretty fun because you can point out all kinds of interesting behavior. You can point out altruism, you can point out zero-sum games, you can point out at the end, they really start thinking about fair share. What does it mean if someone is endowed with 4 bonus points, why can't they be the ones that contribute the most to the public good compared to those that have only 1 endowment? And so it generates a lot of really useful economic conversations within this class. And then, of course, I discuss with them which game is the most difficult and why, and which game do you think most closely resembles global climate talks. Of course, there's a little bit of components in each of these games that relate to climate change and those climate talks. And so this is a nice time to discuss with them what they think climate change negotiations are like. And then, of course, there's the idea of why am I doing this? Well, one of my course objectives is to assess how economic incentives influence individual and group behavior and how this can be used to explain and address environmental challenges. So I want to generate lively discussion about this, but I also want to empirically have them assess an economically efficient outcome. So I give them all these terms. Again, I'm running out of time, so I don't want to go through all of them. And then I give them a homework assignment where I have them empirically assess what should each country do if they're acting in their own economic interest versus public interest, what would make it more likely for them to provide the public good, and what kinds of things might influence their inability to provide the public good. Anyways, sorry, that was super fast. This is a lightning session, but I'm willing to share all this. I'm going to write it up for AETR, so I would love any feedback about what I should include in that manuscript, and feel free to email me if you have any more questions.
All right, thank you, Misty.
No problem.
Any brief questions from the audience?
Hi, I have a question. Mike Jones from University of Alaska at Anchorage.
Mm-hmm.
Melissa, how did you handle, or Misty, sorry, how did you handle unequal provision of points that affected student scores with an IRB application, and sort of how was that received?
Because it's all bonus, it's fine. I submitted the IRB protocol, and there's been no problem on our end. It's only good things that really can come out of this game. And I say that I'm going to hold them to the negative points, but actually that game has never been chosen as binding, so it hasn't been an issue. But it hasn't come up as being problematic on my end, Mike.
Thanks so much, Misty.
No problem.
Any others?
I have a question. Jared Penn, LSU.
Uh-huh.
So Misty, mechanically, do you have to use some sort of online, submission software like Top Hat or Poll Everywhere? Is it in a 50-minute class? How do you implement it?
So this is in a 50-minute class. I use Top Hat, and I've used iClickers in the past too. One thing is I want to be able to actually tie individual responses to the student. I also give them, so like, here, let me go back. I give them this table on a piece of paper, and they fill out this table as they go along, which is important because they each have different papers relating their endowment, especially for these last two games, because the endowments differ across across the class. So they have this paper that they also turn into me. So they respond via clickers so that we can quickly identify how much of the public good was provided. But then in addition to that, they turn in this paper, and I verify with this paper what their actual bonus points were, and connect that with the responses. I did have one semester where students cheated, and they said that they didn't contribute to the public good, but they did, and so then that would inflate their bonus points, and I gave them nothing.
Okay.
So I mean, so for me, I'm just like, I don't want students to cheat. I want them to be honest on their paper, and so that's why it's nice to have it connected to the students. If you are trusting of students, use Mentimeter or whatever you want, but I don't know.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Misty. We're out of time for her slot, but again, if you have follow-up questions for Misty, go ahead and save those for the end of the track session. We'll have lots of time for questions then. Thank you again, Misty. Appropriately enough, we'll switch over to Jared Penn, who just asked the last question. So thank you, Jared.
Give me 1 second. Okay. Okay, is the presentation visible?
Yes.
Okay, very good. All right, so good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jared Penn, I'm at LSU. And so the topic for this presentation is bifurcated classrooms. I slightly modified the title based on having talked with folks to non-issues and insights for natural resource and environmental econ classes. So the premise of this talk was when I would instruct classes at University of Kentucky in grad school, I saw some contentious moments where, some of the environmental or sustainability warriors really felt passionately, and there could be contentious moments with the sort of traditional production ag kids. And I was thinking about how do instructors around the US resolve this, or how often does this occur, and how might that change with the different types of classrooms. So you might find that some of the environmental resource classes, they feature 10 or 20% environmental kids. Others might be a more even split. How does that change with the level of the class in terms of 2,000, 3,000, or 4,000 level classes? And that was the premise for why I was exploring how bad or how often this issue might occur. Okay. And so what I first did was I looked at a variety of programs and basically wanted to understand how often were environmental kids and ag kids going to be in the same environmental resource classroom. I looked at 52 different programs and first identified whether they had the majors or concentrations for agribusiness ag economics, where you might expect to find the traditional ag kids, and whether they had majors or concentrations for environmental resource econ, environmental policy, environmental science or management, any of those types of programs. If I could identify those programs, then I found whether or not these majors were required or had some sort of element of environmental resource as part of their program. Okay, so having gone through those different websites, and I got to give my grad students some credit, they did a lot of heavy lifting there. I found that 28 of the programs that had these majors either required or as an elective had environmental resource economics either as a requirement or as an elective. Meaning that, yes, there is a real prevalence of environmental and agribusiness or production ag students being in the same classroom where a potential contention could happen. Okay, and what I did from there was I basically did a few personal interviews. So I saw Matt was in the room, Matt Enneris from Mississippi State, Misty, who just gave her presentation, Jordan Suter from Colorado State, and then myself. And we each have different sort of perceptions on these things based on what we teach. Matt has about a 50-person class where only 5 or 10 of the students are environmental econ majors. Misty's 2,000 level class has 80 to 100 students where it's a pretty even balance. Jordan had a 4,000 level class where the 10 or 20% are ag, but another 20% are the environmental warriors. And in my class, we don't have an environmental econ major. We just have a few students from an environmental management major that are involved. And so this is really just a summary of some of these thoughts. The one thing I do want to mention going back to this slide is that most of the programs that aren't listed here, it's because they either don't have an environmental resource sort of focus, which is relatively rare, but what is more common are the schools like what you might expect in the Northeast that don't really have agribusiness as part of their programs anymore. They tend to focus more exclusively on environmental resource. Also, I just realized I didn't have my video on. Hello, everyone. So these are the thoughts that we're summarizing. The first thing that I wanted to summarize is the students' reactions based on the instructors in terms of how they perceive environmental resource economics. So the instructors typically don't find that either type of student is particularly resistant to the material, and they are more attracted to the concepts and tools as a way to help think about environmental issues. So they are impressed, the students enjoy the new and methodical nature of thinking. And I like that interpretation. I think that's good for us because it means that the students aren't resistant to the economic way of thinking. Only a small percentage of students ever sort of express that they think the classes is either being liberal or capitalist nonsense. And both groups of students tend to be receptive towards economics and the related skills for environmental resource issues as the class progresses, meaning that they understand or value the economics thinking and get better at it as the class goes on. Okay. So as to how often these issues occur, everyone agrees that moments where you have a sensitive or controversial issue are very seldom. Students are polite, even if they're passionate about the topic. So we just don't find these circumstances where you've got the students, either personally attacking each other. They tend to understand that it is through an economics lens. And the feedback that I got from people was partially on the part of the instructors. We're mindful of the classroom composition in terms of what percent of students are going to be from the different camps. We try to focus on economic tools. We try to focus on economics, the economic lens, as opposed to some other lenses. The other part of it is student training. Students tend to understand trade-offs, and so they aren't going to be in the camp of zero pollution is best or no pollution policy is best either. When it does occur, though, it tends to be for energy, water quantity, and climate change based on feedback. The last piece that I'll mention is that there are opportunities to utilize these different opinions in the classroom. The first was use polarizing opinions to have more engaging discussion. Don't just look for the middle response. Seek out the environmental warriors and the traditional ag kids to get their perspective. Don't you commend as opposed to condemning any particular camp in terms of providing a solution to climate change. And then the last one is making sure see if everyone understands that they are either guilty of or a victim to market failures, that it's not just a farmer to household issue of market failures and externalities. It can be farmer to farmer. It can also be household to household. And that is all I have.
Awesome. Thanks, Jared. I do have a quick question that I'm a little bit surprised didn't come up. What about math competency between the two groups? Is that a barrier or not a barrier?
It came up a little bit in some of the discussions. I can tell you in my own experience, yes, there's resistance to math. And I would say that resistance to math, based on mine and the others' perspectives, is it's more on the ag side, especially the agribusiness side.
Okay.
That's what I have found. I've seen students where it's more like they see it as a business degree. Why is math part of the business degree? Whereas we're all economists and we see math as a complement to economic thinking. But I've seen it more of the resistance on the ag side.
Okay. That's been my experience too, by the way. I just was curious if that was true elsewhere. Any other questions for Jared? Brief questions, we've about 30 seconds. Okay, hearing none, we'll hold any more substantive questions for the end. Thanks a lot, Jared, enjoyed it. Next, we'll move on to a presentation. It's Stephen, Morgan, Lorianne, and Kelly. I think Lorianne, sorry, I apologize. I think Lorianne, you were going to present this, is this correct? Looks like it.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Sorry. Could you see my screen, maybe?
Yes, we see it.
All right. So this work is co-authored by Dr. Morgan and Dr. Grogan, who are respectively the co-chair and the chair of my dissertation. So the context of this game. Sorry. The context of this game is mainly to stem from the economical and environmental impact induced by deforestation, and also in tropical ecosystem, forests are used for more than timber. They are used for multiple products. And the harvest of one product could impact the other. For instance, over-harvest of leaf or fruit can influence a species population dynamics. So an example of a multi-purpose species is Sapzelia africana, which is currently on the brink of extinction. And it's classified as vulnerable on the IUCN Red List and was part of my research for my dissertation. So the game setup is around a group of 5 to 10 students as players, and they would play 10 rounds of the control and 10 rounds of the treatment. And the game can last from 30 to 45 minutes, depending on the size of the group. And the material needed for the game are mainly the structure SS spreadsheet, which is useful to calculate the stock of trees and leaves, and the student SS spreadsheet where they can record and calculate their profits. So the game starts with a stock of tree, which is 10 multiplied by the number of students that you have in the group. And the student can harvest either trees or just decide to harvest leaves or both. And the decisions are made simultaneously, but the the trees are removed sequentially from the stock so that in the last round, some student decision might not be accommodated if the stock is too low. So students are presented with this payout for the trees where they maximize at 4 units of tree harvested and then it slowly decreases. And they also presented with this payout for the leaves where the maximum is at 5 units here and it slowly decreases till the 10, they can harvest a maximum of 10 units. So during the game, the student mainly decide which quantity of tree or timber or leaves they can harvest or they want to harvest. And they submit that decision to the instructor and also record it in their own spreadsheets. And depending on whether they are playing the control or the treatment, they have a PES bonus which is included. So they calculate their own profit. As for the instructor, the main action are to collect the decision from each student or player and to enter it into his spreadsheet or her spreadsheets and determine if the threshold was met to get a bonus if they are playing the treatment. And they use also that spreadsheet to determine a regrowth mechanism that is implemented for trees and leaves. So at the end of each round, the tree will grow and the leaves as well. And they communicate the new stuff to the students. The game is set up as a threshold PES game where the bonus is given if 70% at least of the initial stock remains at the end of the round. And the bonus is said to be 500 tokens per student. And this payment is independent to any earning they may have received from the decision they made during each round. So at the end of the game ends after 10 rounds, both the control and the treatment, or when there are no more trees available on the board game. So at the end of the game, the student will calculate the total profit and the instructor, depending on the class, can award bonus depending on the total profit across both treatment and control round, or they can just randomly select one round to allocate the bonus to the students. So different variation, like this game can accommodate different levels of courses. If we have an introduction to natural resource economics, for instance, the student can be provided with spreadsheet that contain all the formula already, and all they have to do is just to enter the decision of tree and leaves. When we have an intermediate microeconomic class, for instance, we can ask the student to provide, we can provide the student with the price and cost function and ask them to determine the profit function themselves. But for higher level of courses, the student can create themselves their own payment for ecosystem schemes and to implement in the treatment round. So the learning objective for this game is mainly to calculate individual and group profit, maximizing harvest decision, and also to illustrate the tragedy of the common in the absence of conservation policies, and also to analyze how payment for ecosystem service alters harvest decision and stock for timber and non-timber forest products. At the end of the game, we can ask students to compare how they play and what the microeconomy theory predicts. And we can also see how well the group sustain in comparison during the treatment round and the control round, and also how might the PES scheme change to be more effective. I'm gonna skip that. Some curveball that we encountered during the experiment is some students come in with this altruistic behavior, and they tend to play the treatment as if they're playing, they tend to play the control as if they were already playing the treatment game. And some also over-harvest at the first round to some extent to force the older player to reduce the harvest decision, but that doesn't always work. It did not even work. Some think it's better to play communist to have the same decision, but since the individual make the decision, that does not work as well. So yeah, thank you for your attention. I'm open to the question.
Thank you, Lorianne. Does anybody have questions?
Yeah, I would say I found that that's the case too, Lori. Whenever I play Common Pool resource games with my students, they always you know, they're in an environmental class and then they're like, oh yeah, I'm going to be an altruist. I'm going to save it for future, just because I want to show my teacher that I'm this, you know, really progressive person. And so I find it challenging because I kind of have to play the game before I've kind of taught them about common pool resource management. So what are your thoughts on that? Do you think timing would affect those things, or what are your opinions on that?
Uh, I I think is, as you said, they want to show that okay, they are mindful of the environment. Because when you started in the introduction, we explained, I mean, pretty much what the game is about. So it's kind of hard for us to control that aspect, if I can say so, because they will always play the way they will. But for most students, they want to maximize the profit. So they go ahead and start harvesting those units that will give them the most earning, especially as you said, when bonus are the reward, they really forget about all those environmental um, um, thinking that they have, and they just want to earn as much profit as they can. But yeah, some do behave like that, but others just want to maximize. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
You did, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Lorianne,
Yes.
is the leaf harvest a function of the number of trees remaining?
Could you please ask the question again? If the leaf.
So my question is, I understand that students can either harvest trees or leaves.
Yes, or both.
Since leaves grow on trees, my question is whether the harvest of leaves is a function of the number of trees remaining.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, but if they harvest the trees, they won't consider, like, we set the game in a way that, because when you get a tree, you definitely kill the whole leaves. So you wouldn't double count those leaves. So if you want to harvest more leaves, you have to go in and get leaves to get the earning for that leaves. But we don't double count the earning from the tree already onboarded with leaves that this tree already hold. I don't know if I'm making myself clear to you. Did I answer your question?
I think so.
I think he was asking if they harvested all of the trees, would there in the next game be leaves available for students?
Yes, I said we have a regrowth system in the game.
Yeah.
So like at the end of each round, when we still have 5 trees still standing, 1 more tree is added to the board game. And all the tree without leaves will go because we consider it's a new harvesting season and all the leaves comes back in again. So they go in with a new stock, which might not be the same as the previous, depending on how much they harvest. But yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Lori. That'll be it for now. Again, if you have follow-up questions, go ahead and save those to the end. Now we'll move on to Amanda Harker-Steele from Georgia. And yes, we can see your slides. Yeah.
Perfect. Hi. Well, hello, everyone. I am Amanda Harker-Steele. I currently work as an economist for the National Energy Technology Lab, and this is some work that I did as part of my graduate school studies, and it's still ongoing. I've worked on this project with my major advisor, John Bergstrom, who's also at the University of Georgia. The title of the work is Tackling Wicked Problems in Applied Economics, an application to the Bears Ears National Monument. The wicked problem refers to a situation or scenario that is difficult to solve because of its inherent complexity, and these types of problems typically involve complicated policy decisions that affect multiple key stakeholders in more of a broad, extensive context. And as a result, there's almost always a disagreement about what causes the problem itself and what the best way to go about solving it or tackling it. So Riddle and Weber were some of the first to formalize the theory of wicked problems, and they cite the following 10 characteristics that are common to all of these complicated social issues. So given the complex nature of these types of problems, they can't really be traditionally solved by many of the problem-solving techniques that are taught in the classroom. So from conflicts surrounding things such as natural resource management methods issues to agribusiness operations and environmental natural resource economics issues. These are popping up all the time for our students to know how to analyze and solve. But according to Beatty in 2008, the term wicked problems itself is not really well recognized in our field. And in addition, the broader and perhaps more holistic problem-solving skills that are necessary to provide solutions to such problems are not being taught in our courses. So the question really becomes, if these types of problems are very prevalent in our field, then how do we design a curriculum that teaches and trains applied economics students on how to approach and provide solutions to such problems? So we suggest for this study, we assess whether or not the case method is an effective strategy for teaching students how to provide solutions to wicked type policy problems. So the case method is a participatory discussion-based method for learning in which students are presented with a real-world policy problem of interest and are asked to develop both a methodology and a solution to such a problem. So following the case method, students are placed in the role of the decision maker, and they're asked to go about solving the problem while the instructor kind of acts as a facilitator. They get really good hands-on experience. They learn how to work in groups, and it kind of gets them to start thinking about what steps they need to take to approach this type of problem rather than just being provided the methodology themselves. So for our case, for our study, we looked at the Bears Ears National Monument, and we asked students to assess what the net economic value of changes in goods and services would be from changing the size of the Bears Ears National Monument. So a little bit of background on the monument itself. The Bears Ears National Monument was established as a national monument in December of 2016, and it contained about 1.4 million acres of federally protected land. In 2017, the status of the monument was kind of put up for discussion, and recommendations were given to resize the national monument, cutting it by about 85% and leaving just over 200,000 acres of lands to be managed by the public. So as you can imagine, this topic raised a lot of discussion in the news. We've heard from stakeholders who relied on these lands for the tourism industry, who were not necessarily in support of the national monument status. And then we also heard from those who are really interested in preserving the cultural and historical artifacts that are located in the monument, that having that much land is actually necessary. So as part of our study, what we did is we had a semester-long project that we implemented on 2 semesters, one in the spring of 2018 and the other in the fall of 2019. Students that participated in the study were from those who are enrolled in a graduate level applied economics course focused on natural resource economics. We started by providing students with a pre-survey which asked them to whether they agreed or disagreed with declarative statements about wicked type policy problems to gauge kind of what their experience was and how to solve such problems. We also collected information on student level characteristics. And then we divided the students into our class into 5 groups, and these were what we considered our consulting teams. Each consulting team was asked to assess the net economic value of going from the larger size of the Bears Ears National Monument to the smaller size. To kind of motivate the discussion and get students familiar with the policy analysis process, we presented them with 4 different case study exercises, each of which built upon the other. We did a mid-semester check-in about halfway through to kind of see where our students were. And also this allowed us to figure out where we might want to go later on in the semester, or what other information we needed to provide. There was an individual assignment component. So as part of their group projects, students were asked to identify different ecosystem goods and services. The individual assignment allowed them to determine what the economic value of those goods and services were through the benefit transfer application. And then we had students collect all that information and present it in a final project. And as part of that final project, they were supposed to provide recommendations on what the socially optimal size of the Bears Ears National Monument was. The professor and I both were kind of the judges of those presentations. And then we followed everything with the post-survey, which was identical to the pre-survey, so we could assess whether or not students learned about wicked-type policy problems from participating in our study. So we had 6 different categories for ecosystem goods and services that students could choose from. We left this up to the decision of the student after they reviewed the Bears Ears National Monument background that we gave them, as well as any other information they collected from the literature. The categories included recreation and tourism, wilderness areas, timber and minerals, grasslands, ceremonial and historical grounds, and waterways. So depending on the size of the groups, which across both semesters was, I believe, 4 to 5 students in each group, each student had to pick at least 2 goods and services, and at least one of the goods and services per team had to come from the 6 categories. So there were a few doubles, but everyone had to pick at least one from the 6. So the survey that we presented to them included the following 10 questions. The first 7 were the declarative statements about wicked policy problems, and the last 3 were questions that asked them whether or not they had received any training in this area before, whether or not they thought it was appropriate, or whether or not they were familiar with wicked-type policy problems, and they could rank on a Likert scale whether they disagreed or agreed with those statements. So a little bit about our students. We ended up having, across both semesters, we had 34 students participate in our study. We did run this through the IRB. I think that's important to point out. We asked students whether or not they consented to participate in the study, but consenting to participate wasn't the only way that, like, this project was part of their final grade. Only the students who consented, we collected the information from. So most of our students were master's or PhD level ag and applied economics students. We asked them to report on what their typical learning style is. So we have most of our students, about 53% of them, reported that writing was how they learned best, whereas 30% preferred visual representations. We also were interested in what their career expectations were to maybe kind of gauge what their familiarity was with these type of wicked problems. Most of our students, about half of them exactly, plan to go into academia, and then about 20% plan to go work for the federal government, and also another 20% working for the private sector. So I've worked in the private sector for about a year now, and I think looking back at this project, I believe the approach that we took and the presentation has really kind of motivated how I address a lot of problems in my current job. So I think for these private sector interested individuals, this type of approach is really good, as well as academia in terms of teaching students how to teach their students how to tackle these problems. So in order to assess whether or not students gained an understanding of wicked problems, we took the pre and post survey responses to the first 7 questions and conducted a Wilcoxon sign rank test, which is a non-parametric statistical hypothesis test used to compare 2 related samples on repeated measurements of the same thing. So it can basically provide evidence that there's a gaining of an understanding. So what we find is that for 6 out of the 7 questions, students actually did gain an understanding of what wicked type policy problems were and how to address such problems. In other words, after participating in the case study, the difference between the frequency of correct responses, which were, because they were declarative statements, we were considering a response of agree or strongly agree as correct, their difference is statistically different from 0. So some conclusions and next steps for our project. So we find that prior to participating in the study, most of the students either agreed or strongly agreed that they were unfamiliar with the term wicked problems. I think they were familiar with these types of problems, but not in terms of them being labeled as wicked type problems. Based on our results, we find that participation in our case study enabled our students to better understand and deal with these wicked type policy problems. In the semester that I was directly involved in the approach, I found a lot of students were very frustrated with not having a step-by-step procedure for a project. They were used to homework assignments or studying for tests where the methodology was provided to them and they were instructed to learn that methodology, memorize that methodology, and apply it to a similar problem, whereas when you're presented with a wicked problem, it can be a bit more difficult. But we also started thinking ahead, you know, as we started to transition as a result of COVID-19 to online, is how we might implement this type of project in an online group. Mostly everything would be, you know, easily transferred, but there are some issues with group communication that we want to assess. And then we also, you know, we think this is applicable to many other problems besides the Bears Ears National Monument. So that's, I think I'm out of time.
Yeah, I appreciate you doing that. I'm sorry to cut you off, but we will have to move on to the next one. If you do have questions for Amanda, hold those until the end of the term or the session, and we'll get back to you. Thank you very much, Amanda. Moving on, the next presenter is going to be Kelly Coburn from Virginia Tech.
Okay. So I hope you can see the screen.
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to be talking today about a classroom game that I developed for a course in water resource policy and economics, and it's to simulate trading in water markets. So just as a little bit of context, this is a senior level undergraduate course in water policy and economics that I started from scratch when I joined Virginia Tech in 2013. The course has evolved substantially over time, which has changed the way that I've used the game and implemented it in the classroom. So most significantly, the composition of the class has shifted away from sort of a more traditional forestry type of audience into some of our new majors, which include majors in water resource policy and management. The size of the class has also increased substantially from about 10 the first couple of years I offered the class to now 70. And so that's really pushed me to rethink how I implement this game in the classroom. It's worth noting also that even though the composition has shifted over time, these are not generally students who are studying economics or majoring in economics. They are interested generally in natural resource management problems. And so that really has affected the way that I've implemented the game as well. So in this course unit, I have a couple of learning objectives. My first and foremost learning objective is to have the students apply demand curves to calculate marginal and total value of water in competing uses. They've all had introductory micro, but they have not really, I think, tended to think about how to use those tools for the types of natural resource management problems they're interested in. So the goal in this class unit is really to get them to start thinking about what the meaning is behind those calculations and how they can use them in their careers. I'm also trying to expose them to the institutions and level of scarcity in water resources experienced in the Western US. I think many of the students here at Virginia Tech grew up in the Mid-Atlantic. I did as well. And I know I never thought about water before moving to the West Coast. So it really is just an opportunity for them to start to think about different regions' problems. I tackle both of these learning objectives in the context of an application to the Colorado River Basin and the Colorado River Compact. So I'll just give a brief overview of the game and then dive a little bit more into the details. So basically what I do in this game is I assign students different roles, either as potential buyers who are going to represent Southern California water utilities who are trying to purchase water for municipal or domestic use. And then I assign other students the role of potential sellers who represent upper basin states who are representatives on the Colorado Water Conservation Board. And these actors are going to represent agricultural users of water. This activity takes about 2 to 2.5 hours in class. I have a 75-minute class period, so I usually use a whole class period plus about half of a second. What they're going to do in this activity is they'll first use some background information that I give them to estimate their willingness to pay or willingness to accept for water. And then they'll attempt to engage in trade. After doing the trading activity, they'll use the market outcomes to evaluate their group's position. And then they'll be given new information for a second year where there are changes in weather and demand conditions, and they have an opportunity to play the game a second time. And then we conclude with a facilitated discussion. So just a little bit of more detail about how the game is implemented in class. The first thing I do is I assign student roles. And so this is something I thought about as the class increased in size. I originally had students split into 2 groups, one which represented the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California and one that represented the Upper Colorado River Commission. Now that I have a much larger class, I'm splitting the students into about 12 separate groups that represent 8 Southern California municipalities that are competing to purchase water and 4 Upper Basin state representatives who are potential sellers of water. I then give them each a group-specific set of background information that includes information on water use for their region, their demographics of their groups and the people they represent, as well as some social perspectives from the region. I give them information about regional water conditions, so depending on where they are, whether it's a dry year or a wet year. And then I also give them some basic information, including a demand curve, their baseline allocation of water under the Colorado River Compact, and the marginal cost for water in their respective uses. So this is an example of 2 pages from one of the background handouts. And so I'll just point out that on the left, there's some introductory information that sort of sets the stage for the activity, and then some questions they're going to be answering throughout the exercise. And on the right, you can see just a really simple example, always sticking with linear demand curves in this class, about how we're presenting the background information to them. So once they've been given and processed that background information, I'm asking them to calculate the value of water for the marginal value of 1 unit or 1 million acre feet of water in the first year of the exercise. And then they use that calculation as a starting point for deciding on a group bid. So they're going to use that as a bound to set their maximum willingness to pay or minimum willingness to accept. And then there's a little bit of work that goes into how to interpret that, but they're going to use that as a starting point in their attempt to trade. So one of the things that I've done to scale the class from small to large is that I started with bilateral negotiation that played out in sequential rounds. I've now moved in this larger class to a double-blind auction. And I trialed that for the first time 2 years ago, and it's working out really quite well. So once they've done their calculations and they've decided on a bid, I ask them to bring their bids to the podium. I check their math, and then I enter their bids into a spreadsheet I've set up ahead of time. And I use those bids to determine the buyers and sellers in the round, and I'll provide them with a market clearing price. I then give them that outcome and instruct them to evaluate how they did. I want them to calculate the total net benefits from the amount of water that they have at the end of the round, and then also to take into account any revenue or expenditures associated with their trades. After doing it the first round, I then give them updated information that might include a change in weather conditions or a shift or a pivot in their demand curve for their group. And then we enter into a second round of the trading activity. So once they've gone through both rounds of trading, I then conclude by presenting data on real-world trades to the class. And so I then facilitate a class discussion. When I had a small class, this was just an open full class dialogue. I found that that just does not work with 70 or 80 students. Nobody really wants to speak up. And so with a large class, I either send them back to the groups that they worked with to have a discussion, or I'll use a jigsaw approach and actually split the groups up and into new groups so that the new groups have representatives from different original groups. And I provide them with a series of prompts to help them think through, how do the market clearing prices from the activity compare with the real world prices that we've observed from trades, and that's universally met with some shock on their part. I have them think about how their bidding strategy changed between rounds, both as they learned a little bit more about how to play the game and as conditions changed, and how those conditions might affect the prices that they would see from those trading activities. And then I have them think through a little bit more about the institutions in which this trading activity occurs. So how are there potential constraints on trades that arise from institutions and social and economic factors? So that's it for me. If you have questions or comments, I can take some now, but also please feel free to contact me if you have any more.
Great, thank you, Kelly. We have time for one brief question if anybody has them. Great, okay. Thanks again, Kelly. Let's move on then to Sylvia Secchi from Iowa.
Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
All right, let me move this out of the way and start the slideshow. So this is a case study that I have developed a couple of years ago, and I have used it in 2 different classes. The goals of the case studies are to understand, using a concrete example, how the sausage is made, essentially, how the in the regulatory process, the tools and the studies that we as academics in environmental and natural resource economics use are actually deployed. I want the students to think critically about the regulatory use of cost-benefit analysis. I also use the case study for them to play with Excel spreadsheets because as my first slide said, I am not in an economics department, I am in a geography department, and most of the students that have taken this class are either non-majors, taking non-econ majors, taking an environmental economics and policy class for environmental policy majors, or a broader set of students taking environmental impact analysis, and these could be from environmental science to planning students. So their math skills and their kind of like use of these even simple tools are very uneven. These classes tend to be small, so that's been quite helpful compared to Kelly's 70 people's class example that we just heard about. The activity takes up a whole period, mid-semester. I spend quite a bit of time in class discussing issues related to benefit transfer. Because in my experience, this environmental policy students end up working for cities, end up working for local governments. And so they get a lot of pitches about, you know, oh, we need to value ecosystem services. But a lot of these valuations, you know, expand the park, protect the wetland, they're not done using original studies, they're done using benefit transfers. And so I find that this particular case study, because it is so egregious in some respects, really helps them to think through the issues. And here are some of the issues that you know, you can connect with for the rest of class. For the environmental impact analysis class, I have the students read the Boyle and other 2017 science paper that was a policy forum that was a very, very well written and succinct critique of the remaking of the what are the United States 2015 rule. But you can use it to think about the discount rate, you can use it to think about non-point sources versus point sources, and how cost-benefit analysis compares to things like NEPA. So there's no advanced readings. The students must download a spreadsheet. I've had the students work in small groups in terms of the working on the spreadsheet or in pairs. And then there's a PowerPoint presentation that essentially walks the students through the various elements of the cost-benefit analysis and have them think about the analysis using these conceptual qualitative questions. I should say that this last spring, I did this online asynchronously. So I recorded, voice recorded over the PowerPoint, and then when there was a question, essentially the students at home had time to stop the presentation and answer the PowerPoint and then the questions, and then they sent them back to me, submitted them back to me as a sheet. It's not quite the same, but it was what it was this spring, right? So these are the kind of questions that I asked from focusing on the elements of the cost-benefit analysis that had to do with confined animal feeding operations, stormwater administration, application of permits, and the permit application for dredging and filling, and wetland mitigation. The kind of answers that I was looking for here in terms of the winners and losers. And then, of course, at the end, we discuss, after we have reconstructed the 2015 rule, we discuss the Trump administration switch in the 2017 rule that made the biggest category of the of benefits, ecosystem service benefits, the wetland mitigation benefits, non-quantifiable because the studies that had been used in 2015 were too old. So I think I'm done.
Great, nice and efficient, thank you. Anybody have questions for Sylvia? Okay. Seeing none, or they're waiting for the end, we'll go ahead and move on to our final presenter of the day, Iris Baldos from Purdue. Go ahead when you're ready.
Thanks, Carson.
Thank you, Sylvia.
Screen share this one. Alrighty. Alrighty, can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, I'll make it full screen so it's easy to see. Yeah, so I'm Iris Baldos. I'm from Purdue, and I'm presenting on behalf of my other collaborators, Iman Hakiki, Tom Hurdle, David Johnson, and Jing Liu. So the presentation that I'm going to focus on is about this tool that we use in a graduate level class here at Purdue, and also in conferences and workshops with our collaborators. So essentially, the tool is this open source model for SDG analysis. So for those who are not familiar with sustainable development goals, well, a couple of years back, people agreed in terms of what would be the key blueprint that people should follow or leaders should follow when they're developing their policies so that they could ensure a sustainable future by 2030. And when we think about these closely in terms of these goals, you could actually target a couple of these goals that's related to agriculture and environment. And the cool thing here is that there are a lot of trade-offs and synergies across these goals. So if you pursue environmental goals, sometimes it would hamper in terms of your food security goals, because it would mean greater food prices and so on. So that's the key motivation in terms of developing this tool and also teaching these tools to students. So what's this tool? Well, it's this simple G, which is essentially a simplified international model of agriculture, land use, and the environment. So it's a partial equilibrium model for people who are modelers, and essentially it's a bunch of codes that allows you to generate what would be the changes in output if you change key drivers of agricultural demand. So in the model, we're focusing on agricultural demand drivers. You have population, income, diets, bioenergy use, and so on. And then you also have the traditional drivers of agricultural supply, climate change, and agricultural productivity. Now the cool thing about this model is because it's gridded, we can incorporate certain local environmental constraints. So for example, if you have a map of excess nitrogen use in the US, you want to reduce that, you can shock the model and see what would happen to US agricultural production. And one advance that we made, at least for the couple of years, is we've made this tool web-based. So you could just log on to the website, mygihub.org, and you'll be able to access the tool, as well as the teaching materials that we've used for this course. So as I've said, this tool is part of this sustainability course that we've taught at Purdue, I think for almost 6 years now. And the idea of this course, it's designed to talk about each of these drivers of sustainability. So you have population. For example, you have a population as a topic. We invite experts at the department to talk about the status of population projections, how these are made. And then from there, we also supplement the lectures with the readings. So we look at what's the latest population projections by the UN, or if there are some advances. And then from there, we then dive into the second part. So this is like a weekly schedule. So the first part would be a lecture with the expert. Second part would be like lab exercises and Econ 101. So let me backtrack for a bit. So for this particular course, it's an interdisciplinary course. So it's not just students who are enrolled in Econ or Ag Econ programs. It's also other students from engineering. Sometimes we also have folks from food sciences. And because of that, we need to distill, the things into like supply and demand. And we've done that in terms of this lab section, where we not just teach the supply and demand equations, but also the key parts of this computational model within that particular driver, let's say population, how that influences the whole thing. So that's from the teaching part. And the cool thing about this is really half of the course is dedicated to like the students developing their own research idea. So we've, there are a lot of like cool ideas coming from the students, especially from other departments. Some thought about like, what would happen if we increase biofuels in the US? How much would that affect crop demand and translate to food prices and so on? Another interesting thing would be like the food waste. So people have incorporated measures, or students have incorporated measures of food waste and did their class project about that. And some of the students, often they develop the journal articles from that, or it's part of their dissertation thesis. So it's really cool to have that one. Then yeah, finally, if we also put stuff available online. So we have the teaching materials in the past. We put that in mygeohub.org so that people could use it. And also there's a textbook related to this model. And if the institution that you're working on, they have access to the Springer library, then you'll be able to access that textbook too. Now, aside from the graduate course, we've also used this model to teach researchers and also attendees of workshops. And again, it kind of borrows from the materials that we're using from the graduate level course, but it's more concise. So for example, in the one-day course, we typically distill everything into like 2 lectures and then 1 show and tell in terms of how we use the model. Last year, we had like a 3-day short course, which is more intense because these are like our collaborators in a research project. So it's more one-to-one. And then again, if you're interested in looking at the materials, we've posted that in the mygeohub.org website. So I don't have time to look at the tools and to do like a one-on-one how to run it. But if you go to mygeohub.org and create an account, then you'll be able to run this tool and also other tools. And then the cool thing here is that we can select model inputs within this web-based tool. Let's say if you want to have population growth based on historical growth rate, income based on historical growth rate, and so on. So once you've selected those model inputs, you click the run button. It automatically runs the whole model from a server. And then after that, once the model has run, you could just go to the output section and visualize your outputs. So as you can see here, you have this change in global crop production by grid. And the cool thing here is you could like zoom in and zoom out. And that's the great thing for like teaching and showing how these global forces affect, crop production in a particular locality. Then I think I'm going to conclude this talk by just looking at like examples of the applications of Simple G. So here we're looking at 4 constraints in agricultural production. We're thinking of reducing excess nitrogen, reducing water use in irrigated areas, and also reducing cropland use for biodiversity purpose. Let's say if a particular patch of land is currently used in agriculture, what if you don't use that and let it go to the natural land cover, so you'll have a more terrestrial carbon accumulation and biodiversity? What would happen? And the illustration, the idea of this illustration is to really show you the trade-off. So if we pursue these different types of environmental constraints, well, that will have a trickle effect in terms of changing, your food security targets. In this case, we're looking at a graph that shows the increase in undernutrition count versus and also the increase in crop prices when you implement these more constrained environmental targets. And I think, let me just quickly show you the application for the Simple GUS. Basically, it's the same idea. If you have these changes, global drivers, you have population, income, and so on, how would that translate to local changes here, in this case, changes in US cropland between 2010 to 2050. And we could also impute changes in terms of water withdrawals. So I think I'm a little bit off, above time, but yeah, thanks for listening. And yeah, if you have questions, please feel free to ask.
Thank you, Eurus. So we've got about 10 minutes left in the session. Do you have questions for Eurus or any of the other presenters? Feel free to ask them now.
Okay. There you go.
I have two questions for Amanda. The first one, when you were determining their learning style, did you give them those 4 options and define them, or did they self-select those terms?
They self-selected, so we did not define them.
Okay, so you ended up, they picked a number of things and you put them then into 4 categories, or did they only select those 4 categories?
We only selected those 4 categories.
Okay. And then you also said that when the students gave their presentations, you did peer evaluations, and I wondered how you handled those peer evaluations.
Sure. So the peer evaluations were completed individually, and what we did is the final project grade was out of 50 points. 45 of those points were assigned to their presentation grade as a group, and then 5 points were the weighted average of the evaluation that they received from their other teammates. Most students ended up with like a 4 out of 5 or 5 out of 5, but it was a way to kind of hold them accountable between one another.
Okay, so the peer evaluation was within the teams, not from one team to another.
Correct.
Okay, yeah. And I use that too in a team-based learning class where they do peer evaluations within the group to keep them honest. Yes, okay, thanks.
And we also, for the case study days, because we had 4 case study days throughout the semester, if a student was absent, they lost 5 points off of their final project grade, but it didn't impact the rest of the team.
Yeah, I do that too. Okay, good, thank you.
Sure, thanks for asking.
And while we're at Amanda, I was going to ask, could this be shortened? So I noticed that there was like kind of 4 or 5 big checkpoints within here. Could you condense this down so it's not over the course of an entire semester, or is this really meant to be a semester-long endeavor?
I think you might be able to parse it down. We tried to align it with the topics that were being taught in the course at the time. So when we did, one of the case study exercises was teaching students about theoretically appropriate welfare measures, and there's a section within the course notes that also discusses that. So we tried to line those 2 things up together, but it could be, if you wanted to make it a shorter assignment, it could be something that's implemented at the end of the semester. But the pre and post survey, I think doing it over the course of the semester, you're getting the students where you're assuming they have no introduction to these types of problems. Whereas if you were to introduce that pre-survey halfway through the semester, they may be more familiar with natural resource economics, wicked type policy problems. So that's the only flaw I would see in condensing it, is if you didn't want to do the pre and post survey, it could definitely be shortened.
My question's for Jeffrey England. When you were working on the OpenStax material, I assume was all in English. Was that a barrier, or how did you overcome that barrier when you were conducting your classes in the refugee camps?
There was a minimum proficiency with English, which really wasn't that high.
Okay.
So everything was taught in English. There was something like 37 different languages represented in the camp. So we were kind of stuck. There was no chance that we were going to do it in the anybody's native language. But English was pretty prevalent. It really wasn't an issue. I think the biggest challenge for the students was actually when they had to write reflection boards. Writing it up in English was a bit of a challenge. But the OpenStax material was just wonderful. If it wasn't for COVID-19 and everything that's going on right now, I would have seriously considered moving my regular class at ASU to the OpenStax material. I did not have to give anything up by going with OpenStax. And I'm pretty sensitive to how expensive it is for students to buy books and materials now. So yeah, it was great.
Yeah,
Wasn't a
that's
problem.
Okay, that's good to know. And on that OpenStax, I've looked at those materials when I was planning on teaching an introductory micro class, and I was impressed with them. And I don't know if you have any other experience outside of a refugee camp, but I would also be curious. Again, one of the obstacles you see with students is cost, as you mentioned. They don't,
Yeah.
you know, a lot of students just won't read the textbook. You ask them, why aren't you paying attention to what's going on in the textbook? They say, oh, I didn't want to buy it. It's too expensive. So I would wonder what kind of uptake you would get if the materials were literally free and available to everybody.
Well, I have to, I'm not going to name names, but I'll confess that at ASU, I use a very popular textbook that's been around for a long time. And I suggest that they think about buying one edition old. And they can get that for $15 or $18. And, you know, when you start getting up more than a dozen editions, these books don't change very much.
Yeah.
And, you know, $20 or $15 versus $175 means a lot to some of these students.
Yeah.
Jeffrey,
Sorry.
my question for Jeffrey, and maybe for everybody, is have you compared OpenStax with the core econ free textbook?
I have not.
I've used, this is Julian Treem from NC State. I just finished using OpenStax in both summer sessions, and I got multiple comments about how they would have never been able to afford the book because they lost their job, you know, had they not had immediate access to it. So I think it's a solid option. It's not my favorite option. There are other books out there I probably like better that have better resources attached to them, but I'm still going to continue to use it. I think it is on a simpler level than the core book that you just asked about. I think that goes into, it's just, I think it's a little bit higher level. It's not too high by any means, but it includes maybe more details than some of my students probably kind of I have time to go into maybe. I love the core book though.
Yeah, one thing I should probably say is we didn't just take the OpenStax and do exactly what they did. I mean, there was some rewriting, some re-editing. We tailored the PowerPoints to fit the things that we wanted to emphasize. So that was a pretty substantial effort to make the OpenStax material line up with our ASU online class. So I didn't just grab it and run with it. It uses OpenStax as the backbone and the meat, but it's open source, so you know, we changed it to fit our needs.
I had to do that as well, and it was very easy to do. It's extra work, but it's not, I don't think it's too much given that I had all of my students click on the chapters, so I knew like who was doing the things and who wasn't.
Right.
They were at least clicking. I don't know what they got out of it exactly, but they did in fact click, and I think that's a big entry point in making sure that we don't lose students really early on simply because they don't understand the first chapter because they don't have the book.
Yeah, one thing that I do in these classes is, because they're online and I can't really control the students, is I have very large extra credit exams that they can take before the final, and they can take them 3 times. And the students don't realize this, but what they really are is guided self-study. You take the test, you see what you don't know, you get to go back, restudy that section, take it again, and I make sure there's enough points there that it's worthwhile for them to go back and spend hours restudying the class. And that seems to work really well because they realize they can get a pretty good grade if they go and do this extra work. So that's helpful. And I can watch them take that test, and I can see what they know and don't know.
Okay, so just as a heads up, the formal track session itself is scheduled to end at 1:30. That's about Eastern. That's about a minute from now. I don't know what's going to happen once we click over. If AAEA is going to kick us off or whatever, I'm happy to continue the discussion. I just want to give everybody a heads up that that's here. Any other questions or comments anybody wants to make?
I have a question for Misty. I'm wondering if you said you've implemented this study a few times in your course. I'm wondering if you have seen any difference in kind of altruistic attitudes of students between millennial generation and Generation Z learners.
Oh boy, I haven't been teaching long enough to observe that. I wouldn't say.
Okay,
I'm only 32. So
I didn't know if you had.
I'm just a lecturer, so I
in combination.
Oh
Okay.
no. Yeah, I pretty much only have Zennials. I've only taught it over 4 years. But I'm a lecturer, so I teach it repeatedly, semester after semester. So I've taught it a lot of times, but in a short time period in terms of years. I will say that kind of on Jared's point, I do see some differences based on other attributes of students. My environmental students tend to be more of the altruists, whereas my FRE, food and resource economics students tend to be more of the profit maximizers. Although there are exceptions to that, of course. So I do see some of that. But yeah, I haven't been teaching quite long enough to observe the difference between millennials and zennials. Sorry about that.
Oh, it's okay.
Yeah.
Misty, this was just a comment for you or really anyone else that's going to submit to a journal, but I know you said you've done it several times. I always find it so helpful when people say what they did that didn't work in the first few times, because I'm sure that'll be my inclination, is to do something you've already done that doesn't work. And so just maybe including some kind of section in the paper, I always find that very helpful.
Yeah, because it isn't exactly the same as it was before. Like the very first time I taught it, I didn't actually incorporate the sustainability game, the Future Generations game, until probably 2 teachings of it ago. So that was kind of a later add-in, but I think it was a really valuable add-in. I don't know why I hadn't thought about it before. I think I was talking about it with a student. It's like, yeah, but what about future generations? We don't really get at that with this game. And I'm like, you're right, but we could. And so then I incorporated that game. So I used to have 5 and now I have 6 games because I added in that sustainability game. So I can definitely comment on that a little bit about how kind of it has evolved. Also, because it is taught over semesters and my class size changes can be pretty swingy. I've had as little as 60 in the class and as many as 105. So I do have to change the parameters on those public good provisions in terms of the threshold and the provision of the public good every semester I teach, based on how many students I have and what I expect their behavior to be. So I can definitely talk about those things to consider. Do you guys think it's useful to include like the assignment that I provide as well, the homework assignment?
Oh,
Yes, Jared?
absolutely. Any
Okay.
documents that you have that I don't have to recreate?
Yeah, I know, same. I'm like, can that bare ears thing be out right now? Because I'm thinking I might use that in my contemporary issues class as like a big policy thing that I do over a shorter period of time. But yeah, exactly. Okay, thank you guys so much for your feedback on that. I'll try to include that in the paper.
Okay, so unless there are any other questions, I'd like to first start off by thanking the presenters. Again, this was the first of these track sessions. I think it went off pretty smoothly. It's a testament to everybody's Zoom skills at this point. Everybody's getting pretty fluent with this. I expected a lot more problems than there were. So thank you guys. Thank you for your flexibility. And I'll say, I don't know if you're keeping an eye on group chat or anything, but it's last 5 minutes. There've been a lot of comments saying, thank you, everyone. This has been really informative and enjoyable, blah, blah, blah. So thank you. Yeah, it's been really great. Right now, what we're going to do just for the presenters themselves is have a brief chat with Jason Bergtold. He's the editor at AETR. If you are planning on submitting a write-up of your presentation to the journal for a special theme, then this will be a relevant discussion for you. So thanks everybody else. Otherwise, stick on while everybody clears out and we'll talk with Jason. All right, you can go ahead and get started, Jason, sorry.
Yeah, no. So in terms of, I just wanted to make sure if you're planning on submitting a few things, I figured it'd be at a good time to touch base. One is when you do submit and you submit your cover letter, tell me it's for this themed issue, just so I know where to place it, because we want to keep these articles together. Depending on how many submissions we get, it'll either be a separate issue or a themed section. Usually my target for an issue right now is 5 to 7 articles. Otherwise, we'll make it a themed section.
Okay. And to that point, Jason, I've gotten from everybody at least 6 people who have said that they would like to submit. So I think we might make that threshold.
And I think in terms of getting articles turned around in the issue, I mean, I think I foresee, depending on when submissions come in, this could either be one of the first issues next year, special issues. So we're trying to target 4 issues a year right now. And then special issues are on top of that. So like this year, we hope to have 5 to 6 issues. We just released our 3rd. So we have enough articles in process to go probably through 5 issues. So we can still put out another, say, special issue this year. In terms of writing the article, so make sure if you've never gone on to the AETR website, take a look at it, and you can find it through the AAEA website. If you go to the publications, read through the submission guidelines, because I know comments, and here I'll throw it into the chat. But in terms of the requirements for submissions, so make sure you read through the requirements for submissions. So I know for teaching methods like the games, I'm really excited. I think we may have published one kind of game per se. So it'll be nice to get some more games in. And I know people have been mentioning that usefulness for the class. I think in terms of the games, it's highly advantageous to, one, have a teaching note with that. So we do have guidelines on the teaching notes and putting the support materials. So it's likely like, what do you hand out to students? So for the teaching note, it's not just the note itself, but it's also putting in those materials, assignments, questions. What is the actual teaching note, or what is the actual document you hand out to students that describes the game, so the forms and all those, so people can run the game or modify it to their use. And so that would all be included in a supplement. What's nice about that is you have the option of making that just publicly available or by request. If it's by request, we do track who downloads it to give that information back to you. And so that is where, in terms of that, keep that in mind. The other thing in terms of the manuscripts, and it's something we push in case studies, especially in the teaching note, but I think in a game, it's something I think we even mention in the, for these exercises we mentioned in the guidelines, is talk about implementation in the article. I think it's beneficial to talk about your experience. And so even for case studies, we push that. We want to see people who've ran this in a classroom prior to publishing it. So we kind of you're giving those helpful hints to new users. And so your experience, and it also allows you potentially to show data that you've collected on the exercise and show it happened. In terms of that, make sure you, if you are presenting data, survey data, any of that, that you do have IRB approval upon submission. We won't publish until we have that if we think there's a human subjects issue. The other side of that, which is a little bit more nuanced, if you are actually reporting grades, if you do not have a signed informed consent form that's physically signed, and it explicitly mentions that you'll be using students' grades, you will need to get permission from like a registrar. Different universities have different avenues there, but you need to make sure you're compliant with FERPA regulations. And so that's something that you run into more often. If you are, and this is something not widely known, if you're reporting grades or doing analysis with grades and it wasn't collected on a survey, that data is legally protected by FERPA, and you have to have signed informed consent. And you also, it's probably a good idea that you talk with your registrar office and let them know that you're doing that, because that is a legal requirement. And so that's something that could come back to haunt the university, because they can actually lose funding if they violate FERPA from Department of Education. So the impacts there are greater than, I would potentially is greater than human subjects. And so that's something just kind of keep in mind if you are reporting that type of information. In terms of survey, student data, in terms of use, stuff like that, I'm not as worried. That's really human subjects. But keep the other one on your radar if it is something. I've had to go through it myself, publishing data where we did use students' grades, homeworks. And we were actually, the journal we published in actually came back to us and asked for it. And so that's when I kind of got my education prior to being an editor. So it was really useful. It's something we're hoping to publish on a commentary sometime to help guide readers and put that up on the website, but that's still in the works. So that's really all. For me, it's kind of, I just want to remind that. Submission-wise, for me, it's kind of as if you're like me, the semester's starting and you're utterly bogged down with re-prepping courses for, I feel like this is my first semester again. So in terms of if deadlines, October would be nice if we want to get an issue out this year so I can get reviews back. Worst comes to worst, we get as many as we can up in advanced access before the end of the year so you can have it for end of year and get it accepted. For me, the big one's getting you accepted. It depends how you count your articles. I'm not sure. For us, it's if you get it accepted, you're good. And we can get it up into advanced access. We will create a section for the special themed issue or that when we start posting those articles. So we've done that with the special issue on COVID-19 as well. So questions from presenters?
Yeah, you said, so my game, you said it would be most appropriate to do a teaching note along with the supplemental material. How long is that teaching note and how much kind of background into public good games do I need to give, or?
I would say the teaching note is be specific to the game.
Okay.
I think you can, if you feel there you need some, or maybe it's kind of, there's a general resource already, point them toward that. Just put the link for that or the citation and say, hey, here's a couple citations on real good background. Here's what you need to know for my game. And that's kind of, and that's what I've done when I've designed games for my classes is it's more, I write down what I need to know. And that's really what it's enough for the people to get through. And you can always come back and update the supplemental materials.
Yeah. And you can lock the homework assignment behind a login or a request, but the other things you can make widely available. So I should specify within the cover letter which of those components should be locked down and which shouldn't?
We can do that. It's easier if we lock it all down or not lock it down. I mean, if locking it down allows us to just track, people right now, it's just on me. So people email me for requesting. I try to get back within 24 hours. The only downside is it doesn't come to my account here. It's a Gmail account. So it's just, I try to check that and keep that up. And I try to respond within 24 to 48 hours to get those out so people have those available. And so, I mean, if someone's pulling it the night before, they're going to use it tomorrow. I mean, that's a little bit harder, but I do try to get those out to people who ask for them. So, and we are getting more hits on the journals. So, in terms of each issue's gotten progressively more hits. So, other questions?
Cool. Well, I would encourage everybody, if you got questions, reach out. Can they reach out to you, I assume, Jason?
Yeah, they can drop me an email.
Okay, or you can shoot something to me and I can act as a go-between. Doesn't really matter. If questions come up, feel free to reach out. Other than that, thank you all very much for your time and your willingness to do this. I do think it was a great session, and good luck with the upcoming semester.
Thanks, Carson.
All right, thank you.
Thanks
so much.
Thanks. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.